There are places on a map that don't want to be found. We rangers call them dead zones. The locals call them cursed. The government calls them containment sites. But in the autumn of 1998, deep in the suffocating wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, I just called it Sector 9. My name is Arthur Vance. For 30 years, I kept this story buried in the bottom of a whiskey bottle and a stack of sealed psychiatric reports. They told me I had a breakdown. They told me the house wasn't real. They told me the voice on the radio was just static. But the dreams are getting worse, and the phone calls, they haven't stopped. What you are about to hear is the unredacted truth of that night. It is a story about a house that defied the laws of physics, a radio that broadcasted my own death from the future, and the terrifying realization that sometimes the only thing worse than being hunted by a monster is being hunted by yourself. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and whatever you do, don't answer the phone. What I experienced as a park ranger in 1998 will haunt me forever. I don't say that lightly. I'm not a man prone to exaggeration, nor am I someone who believes in ghost stories told around a campfire to scare city kids. I was a man of maps, compasses, and protocols. I dealt in the tangible reality of lost hikers, bear sightings, and flash floods. But what I found in those woods, deep within the sprawling, suffocating greenery of the North Cascades, defied every law of nature I swore to protect. It broke me. It took the man I was and left a hollow shell that shakes when the sun goes down. It was mid-November. In Washington state, we call this the beginning of the gray season. The vibrant reds and oranges of autumn had already rotted away into a brown sludge on the forest floor, and the sky was a permanent, bruising shade of slate. I was stationed at Firewatch Tower 4, a lonely outpost perched precariously on a granite ridge overlooking the majestic, endless valleys of pine. My name is Arthur Vance, and at the time, I had been a ranger for 15 years. I loved the silence. I loved the isolation. Or at least, I thought I did until that Tuesday night. It was 11:42 p.m. The wind was howling against the glass panes of the tower, a rhythmic battering that usually lulled me to sleep. I was nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, reading a paperback I'd probably read 3 times before, when the radio, my only lifeline to civilization, hissed into life. It wasn't the standard static check. It was a violent, piercing shriek of white noise that made me jump, spilling coffee over my boots. I grabbed the receiver, my heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Tower 4, this is Vance," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Identify." Nothing but static. Heavy, wet static. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy chain across a concrete floor. "Station base. Is that you?" "Over." Then, the static broke. For a split second, a voice cut through. It was garbled, distorted as if speaking through a mouthful of water, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pure, unadulterated terror. "Don't let it in. Arthur, the door—" I froze. My grip on the plastic receiver tightened until my knuckles turned white. They didn't use my call sign. They used my first name. And the voice— God help me. The voice sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it. It sounded like me, but older, rougher. "Who is this?" I shouted, abandoning protocol. "What is your location?" The static returned, louder this time, mixed with a sound that made my skin crawl. A low, mechanical thrumming, like a massive generator spinning up deep underground. Then, silence. I looked at the triangulation monitor. The signal had lasted long enough for the primitive system to get a rough fix. I traced the coordinates on the topographic map spread across my desk. My finger stopped, and a cold chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows settled in my marrow. The signal had originated from Sector 9. Every park has its ghost stories, its bad spots. In the Cascades, we had Sector 9. It wasn't officially marked on the tourist maps. To the public, it was just unnamed wilderness. To us rangers, it was the dead zone. Radios didn't work well there. Compasses spun in lazy circles. We had lost 2 search dogs in that valley in the late 80s. They just ran into the brush and never barked again. We didn't go there unless we absolutely had to. But a distress call was a distress call, and that voice, it clawed at the back of my mind. I grabbed my gear, heavy raincoat, flashlight, medical kit, and my service revolver. I didn't usually carry the gun for routine checks, but something about that mechanical thrumming sound made me slide the .38 into its holster. I took the Jeep as far as the logging road would allow, the headlights cutting through the thick, soup-like fog that had rolled in. The rain was relentless, drumming on the roof like 1,000 nervous fingers. When the road turned to mud too deep for the tires, I got out and walked. The hike to the coordinates should have taken an hour. It felt like days. As I crossed the boundary into Sector 9, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The wind died down. The rain, which had been torrential, seemed to mist in the air, suspended, defying gravity. But the worst part was the silence. If you've spent time in the woods, you know silence is never truly silent. There's the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. But this was a vacuum. No crickets, no wind in the boughs. Just the wet squelch of my boots in the mud and the ragged sound of my own breathing. I checked my GPS. I was close. The terrain here was supposed to be rugged, steep ravines and dense clusters of Douglas fir. But as I pushed through a particularly thick wall of ferns, the forest floor leveled out. I stumbled into a clearing and stopped dead. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I blinked, wiping the rain from my eyes, sure that I was hallucinating from fatigue or altitude. There, in the middle of the most remote, hostile wilderness in Washington state, miles from the nearest paved road, stood a house. It wasn't a cabin. It wasn't a ranger outpost. It was a pristine, 2-story suburban home, painted a cheerful butter yellow with white trim. It looked like it had been plucked straight out of a 1950s neighborhood in Ohio and dropped into the primordial forest. There was a manicured lawn, green, perfectly cut grass, that ended abruptly where the savage forest floor began. A white picket fence surrounded the property, and the lights were on. Warm, inviting yellow light spilled from the downstairs windows, casting long, unnatural shadows against the towering pines that loomed over the roof. I could see a silhouette moving behind the sheer curtains. I checked my radio. Dead. No static. Just a void. I put my hand on the grip of my revolver, my breath hitching in my throat. This was impossible. Logistically, physically impossible. There were no roads to bring in materials, no power lines to feed those lamps. I walked toward the white picket gate. It swung open with a smooth, well-oiled creak that sounded deafening in the unnatural silence. I stepped onto the concrete walkway, leaving muddy boot prints on the clean pavement. I reached the front door. It was solid oak, with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. I hesitated. The instinct to run, to turn back and flee to the safety of the Jeep, was overwhelming. But I was a ranger. I had a job to do. Someone had called for help. I raised my hand and knocked 3 times. The door didn't open, but from inside, I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was the sound of a radio, tuning through static, and then my own voice, clear as a bell, coming from the living room. Tower 4. This is Vance. Identify. It was the recording of me from an hour ago. I pushed the door handle. It was unlocked. I stepped over the threshold, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind me with a resolute click that sounded final, like the latch of a prison cell engaging. The transition was instantaneous and disorienting. One moment, I was standing in the biting cold of a mountain storm, the air thick with the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves. The next, I was enveloped in dry, stagnant warmth. The howling wind, which had been deafening just seconds ago, vanished completely. It wasn't that the walls were thick. It was as if the world outside had simply ceased to exist. I stood on a plush, cream-colored carpet, water dripping from my raincoat, pooling around my muddy boots in a dark, spreading stain. I felt a pang of irrational guilt, the kind a child feels when tracking dirt into their mother's clean hallway. It was an absurd emotion to feel while investigating a distress call in a phantom house, but the domesticity of the scene hijacked my instincts. "Hello?" I called out. My voice didn't echo. The room absorbed the sound, swallowing it whole. "Ranger service. Is anyone here?" The radio I had heard from outside, the one broadcasting my own voice, had fallen silent the moment I entered. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room before finding a light switch on the wall. I flipped it. A crystal chandelier overhead flickered to life, bathing the room in a soft, golden glow. I holstered my flashlight, but kept my hand hovering near the .38 on my hip. The interior was a museum-perfect preservation of 1950s Americana. Floral wallpaper, heavy velvet drapes drawn tight, a fireplace with logs arranged in a perfect pyramid, but unlit. On the mantelpiece, a clock ticked with a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to sync with the thudding of my own heart. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I moved deeper into the living room. There, on a mahogany side table, sat the source of the audio, a large vintage Philco radio console. I approached it cautiously. The dial was glowing amber, but the needle wasn't moving. It was set to a frequency that didn't exist on civilian bands. I touched the top of the wooden cabinet. It was warm. Not warm from operation, but warm like organic matter, like skin. I recoiled, wiping my hand on my trousers. "Is anyone home?" I tried again, louder this time. The only answer was the smell. It hit me then, wafting from the adjacent room, the savory, rich aroma of roasted meat and rosemary. My stomach gave a treacherous growl. I hadn't eaten since noon, but the appetite was quickly replaced by nausea. Cooking meant people. People meant answers. But here, in Sector 9, it felt like a trap. I followed the scent into the dining room. The sight that greeted me was more unsettling than any crime scene I had witnessed in my 15 years as a ranger. A long cherrywood table was set for 4. Fine china, polished silverware, crystal wine glasses. In the center, a roasted chicken sat on a silver platter, steam still rising from it in lazy spirals. Bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans were passed around as if a family had been sitting there just seconds before I walked in. I walked around the table. 3 of the chairs were pushed in. The 4th, at the head of the table, was pulled back, angled slightly, as if the diner had stood up in a hurry. I reached out and touched the porcelain rim of a plate. Hot. Searingly hot. "This isn't possible," I whispered to myself. I looked at the walls. They were covered in framed photographs. I stepped closer to inspect them, expecting to see the residents. Maybe a smiling nuclear family on a beach, or a graduation photo. What I found made the breath hitch in my throat. The photos were generic, blurry, but the longer I stared at them, the more they seemed to shift. A landscape of a beach that looked suspiciously like the lake where I proposed to my late wife, Helen. A photo of a dog that looked exactly like Buster, the golden retriever I had as a boy. But the faces of the people in the pictures, they were smeared, like wet oil paint that someone had dragged a thumb across. They had no eyes, no mouths, just smooth, fleshy indentations. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I gripped the back of the empty chair to steady myself. This place wasn't just a house, it was a collage of memories, constructed by someone, or something, that didn't quite understand how humans worked. It felt like a stage set designed by an alien intelligence. That's when I saw it. Beside the plate at the head of the table was a small, leather-bound notebook. I picked it up. The leather was cracked and old. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, scrawled in heavy charcoal. Entry 1. The fog brought me here. It looks like home, but the doors don't lead out anymore. Entry 4. The food never rots. It stays hot. I tried to eat it, but it tastes like ash. Entry 12. It watches me from the mirrors. It wants to know what I'm afraid of. I flipped to the final entry. The ink was fresh. Wet. Entry 44. Arthur is here. He's standing in the dining room. He's reading this now. I dropped the book as if it were burning hot. It hit the floor with a thud. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't just observing a scene. I was part of the script. I drew my revolver. "Show yourself!" I screamed, spinning around, aiming at the empty corners of the room. "Come out!" Suddenly, a sound cut through the heavy silence. Roaring. It came from the hallway. A black rotary telephone sitting on a small gossip bench. Roaring. The sound was shrill, mechanical, and demanding. I shouldn't have answered it. Every instinct in my reptilian brain screamed at me to smash the window and dive back into the storm. But the pull was magnetic. It was the same compulsion that makes you look over the edge of a cliff. I walked into the hallway. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver. I lifted it slowly and brought it to my ear. "This is Ranger Vance," I said, my voice barely a whisper. There was silence on the other end. Then, a sharp intake of breath. "Arthur." My blood ran cold. I stopped breathing. It was Helen's voice, my wife. My wife who had died in a car accident 3 years ago. "Arthur, please," she wept, her voice sounding tinny and distant, as if calling from the bottom of a well. "You have to listen to me. The house, it's not a house, it's a stomach, and it's waking up." Before I could respond, before I could beg her to speak again, the line went dead. And then, from the top of the stairs, directly above my head, I heard the heavy, deliberate creak of a footstep. Something was walking down to meet me. The footsteps didn't sound like boots on wood. They sounded like wet meat slapping against a hard surface, disguised as the heavy tread of a man. Slap thud, slap thud. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, the receiver of the telephone still dangling from its cord, swinging like a pendulum. Helen's voice, or the cruel mimicry of it, had been cut off, leaving only the terrified hammering of my heart. I raised my .38 revolver with both hands, aiming it squarely at the darkness of the second-floor landing. My palms were slick with sweat, making the rubber grip feel treacherous. "Stay where you are!" I bellowed. My voice cracked, betraying the steel veneer I tried to project. "I am a federal park ranger. I am armed. Step into the light with your hands visible." The footsteps stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, the house returned to that suffocating silence. The clock in the living room continued its mockery of time. Tick, tock. Then, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the upper hallway. It stepped into the amber glow of the chandelier. It was wearing a grey cardigan, pressed slacks, and slippers. It looked, at a glance, like a father coming down to investigate a noise in the night. But the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, hanging past the knees. The shoulders were hunched in a way that suggested the bones underneath had been broken and reset at awkward angles. But it was the face that made my gorge rise. It was smooth. There were no distinct features, no nose, no lips, no brow ridge. Just a flat, pale expanse of flesh, like uncooked dough. And then the flesh rippled. An eye opened in the center of the forehead, blue, terrified, human. Then a mouth tore open on the cheek, screaming silently. Then another eye on the chin. The features were bubbling to the surface, boiling and receding, trying to assemble a face from 1,000 stolen memories. "Arthur," the thing gurgled. It didn't use a mouth. The sound seemed to vibrate from its chest. It wasn't one voice. It was a chorus. A child's whimper, an old man's rasp, and under it all, the deep, grinding sound of shifting tectonic plates. "We've been waiting for dessert." Terror, cold and primal, overrode my training. I didn't issue another warning. I squeezed the trigger. Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The recoil jarred my shoulder. I saw the hole punch through the thing's chest, right through the grey cardigan. But it didn't fall. It didn't bleed red. A thick, black tar erupted from the wound, sizzling as it hit the carpet. The creature didn't scream in pain. It laughed, a wet, hacking sound. The walls of the hallway suddenly contracted. The floral wallpaper stretched and tore, revealing not plaster and lath, but pink, glistening muscle. Veins pulsed beneath the surface of the wall. Helen was right. It wasn't a house. It was an organism, and I was the pathogen it was trying to isolate. The creature lunged. It moved with terrifying speed, skittering down the stairs on all fours like a spider. I fired 2 more shots. Bang, bang, aiming for the head, or where a head should be. One bullet took a chunk out of the banister. The other struck the creature's shoulder, spraying more of that black ichor. It staggered, giving me a split second. I turned and sprinted for the front door. I threw my shoulder against the heavy oak, fumbling for the handle. It wasn't there. The brass handle was gone. The lock was gone. The seam where the door met the frame had vanished. The wood was smooth, unbroken, fused into the wall. I pounded on it with my fist, screaming in frustration. "Let me out! Let me out!" The wood felt soft under my fist, warm, living. I looked back. The creature was at the bottom of the stairs, rising to its full, impossible height. The shadows in the living room were lengthening, turning into grasping claws that reached for my ankles. I couldn't go out. I had to go deeper. I scrambled away from the door, slipping on the polished floor, and bolted toward the kitchen. I remembered the layout of these cookie-cutter 50s homes. The kitchen usually had a back door or a connection to a garage. I burst into the kitchen. The smell of the roast chicken had turned rancid, like rotting garbage in the summer sun. The chicken on the table was pulsating, expanding and contracting as if it were breathing. I ignored it and ran for the far door, throwing it open. I expected the cool night air. I expected the forest. Instead, I stumbled into a room that shouldn't have existed. It was a nursery. The walls were painted a soft pastel blue. Mobiles of little wooden airplanes hung from the ceiling, spinning slowly in a draft that wasn't there. In the center of the room sat a white crib. I froze. The adrenaline in my veins turned to ice. Helen and I, we had tried. For 5 years, we had tried. We had painted a room just like this in our old house in Seattle before we moved near the park. We bought the crib. We bought the mobiles. But the baby never came. The miscarriages broke us, piece by piece, until we stopped talking about it, until we closed the door to that room and never opened it again. This room was an exact replica of the nursery we had built in 1990, down to the specific chip in the paint on the windowsill. "No," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." "You're in my head." From inside the crib, a sound emerged. Not a cry, a giggle. I shouldn't have looked. God help me, I should have turned and run back to the monster in the hallway. But the pull of grief is stronger than fear. It hooks into your soul and drags you down. I walked to the crib. My hands shook violently as I gripped the white railing and leaned over. The crib was empty of any child. Instead, lying on the mattress was a radio. My handheld Motorola radio from the future. The red light was blinking, recording. I reached down and picked it up. Static hissed. Then, my own voice, ragged and exhausted, spoke from the speaker. "Arthur, if you're hearing this, you're already digested. The nursery is the stomach acid. It dissolves your will to live. Don't look at the window. Whatever you do, don't look at the window." I slowly lifted my head. Across the room, there was a single window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see through the gap. Outside, it wasn't the forest. It wasn't the night. I saw a vast red sky, and under it, stretching to the horizon, were thousands of other houses exactly like this one. A suburban sprawl of hell. And walking between them were things as tall as skyscrapers, their legs long and thin like needles, picking up the houses and shaking them like toys to see what fell out. One of the giants stopped. It turned its massive, eyeless head toward my window. It saw me. The ceiling screamed. It wasn't the sound of wood splintering or drywall cracking. It was the high-pitched, wet tearing of ligaments snapping under immense pressure. I threw myself to the floor, covering my head with my arms, just as the roof of the nursery was ripped away. The vacuum of that alien atmosphere sucked the air out of the room, pulling the crib, the mobiles, and the illusion of my unborn child into the crimson sky. I looked up, just for a second, and saw it. A massive, 5-fingered hand, skin the color of bruised slate, descending from the red clouds. It grasped the upper edges of the house, my house, this living trap, and squeezed. The walls bowed inward. The pastel blue paint of the nursery flaked away, revealing the pulsing, raw meat beneath. The floorboards buckled, creating a steep slide toward the hallway. I didn't have a choice. I let gravity take me. I slid out of the nursery, scraping my elbows against the floor, tumbling into the corridor just as the giant's thumb punched through the nursery wall, obliterating the room I had just been standing in. The house groaned, a deep, subterranean bellow of pain. The creature in the grey cardigan, the father, was nowhere to be seen, likely knocked off balance by the seismic shifting of the house. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented. The hallway was tilting at a 45-degree angle. The logic of the architecture was failing. Doors were opening into brick walls. The chandelier was swinging sideways. I needed to get down. In every structural collapse, the basement is the tomb. But in this madness, it felt like the only place the giant's fingers couldn't reach. I saw a narrow door tucked under the staircase. In a normal house, it would be a coat closet. Here, dark, foul-smelling air was seeping from the crack beneath it. I kicked the door open. There were no stairs, just a wooden chute, slick with a translucent slime. I hesitated, looking back at the ruins of the second floor where the red sky was bleeding in. Then, the house lurched again as the giant lifted it off the ground. I jumped into the chute. I slid down into the darkness, the slime soaking through my trousers, the smell of copper and ozone filling my nose. It felt like sliding down the throat of a leviathan. I tumbled for what felt like an eternity, twisting and turning before I was spat out onto a cold, hard concrete floor. I gasped, rolling onto my back, aiming my flashlight into the gloom. I was in a basement, but it wasn't the basement of the suburban house. It was vast, extending into the darkness far beyond the beam of my light. It looked like a government storage facility or a bunker, cold and industrial. Concrete pillars held up the ceiling, which was dripping with that same black ichor I had seen earlier. But it was what lay between the pillars that made me retch. Piles, endless piles of stuff. To my left, a mountain of backpacks, hiking boots tied together by their laces, water bottles, cameras. To my right, a stack of park ranger uniforms, dating back decades. I saw the olive green wool of the 1950s uniform, the synthetic blends of the 80s. This wasn't just a trap for me. It was a feeding ground that had been operating for half a century. Sector 9 wasn't a superstitious anomaly, it was a slaughterhouse. I moved through the aisles of the dead, my flashlight cutting through the dust motes. I needed a weapon, a tool, anything better than my .38 with 3 bullets left. Then I saw a flickering light in the distance, a green glow. I approached it cautiously, stepping over a pile of rusted hunting rifles. Tucked into a corner, barricaded by stacks of old crates, was a makeshift command post, a folding table, a camping lantern running low on fuel, and a complex array of radio equipment that looked modified, jury-rigged with wires and duct tape. And sitting in the chair, slumped over the desk, was a figure. "Federal Ranger," I announced, my voice trembling. "Identify yourself." The figure didn't move. I walked around the table and shone the light on him. It was a man, or what was left of one. He was mummified, his skin drawn tight over his skull like parchment paper. He wore a tattered lab coat over a military uniform. On his chest was a badge. Dr. Aris Thorne, Project Threshold, 1974. He had been dead for over 20 years, but his hand was resting on a notebook. I gently pulled the book from under his skeletal fingers. The pages were brittle. I flipped to the end. October 14th, 1974. The experiment has failed. The entity doesn't just mimic space, it mimics consciousness. It learns from our fears. We thought we could contain the breach in Sector 9, use it as a waste disposal for redacted files. But it got a taste for the archivists. Now it wants more. It feeds on narrative. It needs a story to digest the soul. That's why it builds the houses. That's why it creates the loops. It needs you to play the role. I looked up from the book, a cold realization settling in my gut. The dinner table, the nursery, the father, it was all a play. And I was the lead actor. If I refused to play, the house would collapse. If I played along, I would be digested. I looked at the radio equipment. Dr. Thorne had been trying to build a jammer, or a beacon. Suddenly, the radio on the desk crackled to life, not with static, but with a clear, rhythmic tapping. Morse code. Bis S-T-O-P-I-T. Then a voice. My voice. But it wasn't coming from the radio on the desk. It was coming from the Motorola I had picked up in the nursery, the one I had shoved into my pocket. I pulled it out. The recording light was off. This was live. "Arthur," the voice on the radio said. It sounded breathless, as if running. "Arthur, listen to me closely. You are in the basement. I know because I was just there 3 days ago. You're looking at Thorne's body." I brought the radio to my lips, my hand shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. "Who is this? Are you me?" "I'm you," the voice replied. "I'm you if you don't make the right choice in the next 5 minutes. The loop is closing. The entity is done playing house. It's coming down the chute." As if on cue, a wet slapping sound echoed from the dark opening of the chute I had just fallen through. Then came the scrabbling of claws on concrete. The father had followed me down. And this time, it brought the darkness with it. "There's a breach," the other Arthur said, his voice desperate. "Behind the crates. Thorne found it but couldn't fit through. It leads to the control room of the facility, back in our reality. But you have to distract it. You have to give it a story it can't process." "How?" I whispered, backing away as the creature emerged from the shadows. It had changed. It was no longer wearing the cardigan. It was a mass of limbs and teeth, a biological shrapnel bomb of every nightmare I had ever had. "You have to lie to it," the radio said. "It eats truth. It eats memory. Feed it a lie so big it chokes." The creature lunged. The creature didn't run. It flowed. It was a landslide of flesh and bone, closing the distance between us with a speed that made a mockery of physics. The air in the basement grew heavy, tasting of copper and ozone, vibrating with the entity's hunger. It wasn't just trying to kill me. It was trying to absorb me, to peel the memories from my mind like skin from an orange. "Feed it a lie," the voice of the other Arthur echoed in my ear. "Make it choke." I had seconds. My instinct was to raise the revolver, to empty the last 3 rounds into that approaching nightmare. But bullets were truth. Bullets were a physical reality. This thing ate reality. I holstered the gun. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. To stand defenseless before a predator requires a suppression of survival instinct that borders on madness. I stood my ground, spread my arms wide, and looked directly into the bubbling, chaotic mass of eyes and teeth that was about to consume me. "You think I'm afraid?" I shouted, my voice booming in the cavernous concrete tomb. "You think I came here by accident?" The creature stopped. It was 10 feet away. The father's face, or what was left of it, surfaced from the mass of flesh. It tilted, confused. The narrative had changed. The prey wasn't running. The prey was posturing. "I didn't lose them," I lied, screaming the words with every ounce of conviction I could muster. I visualized the lie, constructing a false memory in my mind, painting over the grief of my wife's death with a fabricated layer of malice. I didn't lose Helen. I sacrificed her. I gave her to the road so I could find you. The air around the creature shimmered. A low, grinding sound, like gears stripping, filled the room. It was trying to process the input. It expected sorrow, regret, the sweet nectar of victimhood. Instead, I was feeding it a jagged, poisonous shard of false villainy. "I am not the food," I roared, taking a step toward the monster. "I am the eater. I came to Sector 9 to carve you out and take your place." The creature shrieked. It wasn't a sound of anger. It was the sound of feedback. The truth I was projecting contradicted the biological data it had harvested from my fears. The basement walls began to flicker. The piles of hiking boots and backpacks phased in and out of existence, replaced momentarily by wireframe grids and static. The entity convulsed, its form destabilizing. It retched, spewing black tar onto the floor. It was choking on the paradox. "Now, Arthur, the crates!" the radio screamed. I didn't hesitate. While the entity thrashed, trying to reconcile the conflicting realities, I turned and sprinted toward the barricade of wooden crates behind Dr. Thorne's desk. I slammed my shoulder into the rotting wood, shattering it. Behind the debris, hidden in the shadow of a support beam, was a heavy steel blast door. It was slightly ajar, jammed open by the calcified remains of a human arm, someone who hadn't made it through in 1974. I didn't look at the arm. I wedged my fingers into the gap and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, rust raining down like dried blood. "You cannot leave!" the entity bellowed behind me. Its voice was no longer a chorus. It was a singular, terrified boom. "The story isn't finished!" I felt a cold, wet tendril wrap around my ankle. "The story is a lie!" I yelled, and I kicked back with my heavy boot, connecting with something soft and gelatinous. I threw myself through the gap in the door, tumbling into the darkness beyond. The sensation was instantaneous and excruciating. It felt like being pushed through a sieve. My vision went white, then inverted to black. I felt my body stretching, compressing, every atom vibrating as I crossed the threshold between the pocket dimension and the base reality. I hit the floor hard. Dust, dry, ancient dust, puffed up around me. I coughed, rolling onto my side, gasping for air that tasted stale but real. There was no smell of ozone, no smell of roasting meat, just the scent of old paper and dead machinery. I clicked on my flashlight. I was in a control room, but this wasn't the makeshift setup in the basement. This was the actual facility. Rows of reel-to-reel tape banks lined the walls, silent and still. Green monitors sat dark and dead on long consoles. A faded banner on the wall read, "United States Department of the Interior, Project Threshold, authorized personnel only." I was back in the real world, or at least a version of it that adhered to the laws of physics. I checked my ankle. There was a bruise in the shape of a handprint, purple and deep, but the tentacle was gone. I scrambled to my feet, my body aching. I needed to get out. I needed to find the exit and blow the entrance to this valley so no one would ever find it again. I walked toward the main console. One monitor was flickering, a single green phosphor screen in a sea of darkness. I leaned in close. The image was grainy, low-resolution black and white. It showed a view from a security camera. It showed the dining room, the pristine 1950s dining room I had first entered. And sitting at the table was me. Not a reflection. Me. The Arthur Vance from 3 hours ago. I watched myself pick up the leather notebook. I watched myself turn around and draw my gun. My blood ran cold. I wasn't just watching a recording, I was watching the feed. The house wasn't just a trap, it was a loop. And if I was here watching myself, that meant I hadn't escaped the cycle. I had just moved to the observation deck. My hand went to my pocket for the radio. I pulled it out. "I made it," I whispered into the receiver. "I'm in the control room." The radio remained silent. The blinking red light of the recording function was gone. Then a new sound came from the main console. A speaker crackled to life. "Tower 4, this is Vance. Identify." It was my voice. The distress call, the one I had heard at the very beginning. I looked at the microphone on the console in front of me. A terrifying realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The distress call I heard in the fire tower, the one that lured me here, it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a recording from the past. It was me. Now. I had to send the signal. I had to lure my past self here, because if I didn't, the loop would break, and the entity, starved of its protagonist, would expand outward, consuming not just the valley, but everything beyond it. Dr. Thorne's notes flashed in my mind. It needs a story to digest the soul. I wasn't the survivor. I was the bait. I stared at the microphone. My hand hovered over the transmit button. If I pushed it, I condemned myself to the hell I had just lived through. If I didn't, the thing in the basement would break free into the real world. Then, I saw something on the monitor that changed everything. In the corner of the dining room screen, hiding in the shadows behind the curtains, was another figure. It wasn't the monster. It was wearing a ranger uniform. It was holding a device that looked like a detonator. It was the third Arthur. I stared at the monitor, my breath fogging the cold glass of the screen. The grain was coarse, the image flickering with magnetic interference. But there was no mistaking the man hiding in the velvet shadows of the dining room. It was me. But it wasn't the me who had just stumbled through the woods. It wasn't the me standing in this control room. This third Arthur looked older. His uniform was torn, his face smeared with ash and dried blood. He wasn't looking at the monster or the father that was currently stalking the hallway. He was looking directly at the hidden camera lens. He was looking at me. In his hand, he held a bundle of road flares taped together around a canister of propane. A crude, desperate bomb. The realization hit me with the weight of a collapsing star. The loop wasn't a circle. It was a spiral, a grinder. There was the prey. The Arthur who was currently driving his jeep through the mud, innocent and terrified, approaching Sector 9. There was the observer, me, the one who had survived the house, fallen through the basement, and reached the control room. And there was the executioner, the Arthur on the screen. The version of me who had realized that escaping wasn't enough. The version who had chosen to stay behind in the belly of the beast to kill it. The speaker on the console crackled again, the static hissing like a snake. Tower 4. This is Vance. Identify. That was the cue. The timeline was hemorrhaging. If I didn't answer, if I didn't play my part, the loop would shatter. The entity, currently confined to the house by the narrative logic of the loop, would have no story to follow. It would break containment. It would spill out into the Cascades, consuming everything. The towns, the cities, the world. I had to damn myself to save everyone else. I had to lure the innocent Arthur into the trap so he could eventually become me. And I had to finish what the third Arthur was about to start. I pressed the transmit button. The plastic felt cold and greasy under my thumb. Tower 4, I choked out, my voice rough with tears I refused to shed. This is Vance. I watched the audio meter spike on the console. I was speaking to the past. I was the ghost in the machine. Station base, is that you? Came the reply from the innocent Arthur, driving his jeep 3 hours ago. I closed my eyes. I remembered the fear I felt in that moment. I remembered the white noise I had heard. It wasn't interference. It was my own hesitation. I leaned into the microphone. I had to warn him, even though I knew he wouldn't understand. I had to give him the fear he needed to survive the night. Don't let it in, I whispered, the words tearing out of my throat. Arthur, the door, don't let it in. I released the button. On the monitor, the scene shifted. The innocent Arthur had arrived. He was walking up the path. The father, the entity, was distracted, sensing fresh meat. And then, the executioner moved. The third Arthur on the screen stepped out from the curtains. He didn't look at the innocent version of himself entering the front door. He looked up, straight into the camera, and gave a single, somber nod. He pulled the pin on a grenade taped to the propane canister. Boom. There was no sound in the control room, only the violent shaking of the ground. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating my hair and shoulders. The monitor flared white, then cut to static. The connection to the pocket dimension was severed. The blast door I had squeezed through, the one leading back to the basement, slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss, sealing the breach. The thin place had been cauterized by fire. But the facility was unstable. The tremors were getting worse. The concrete floor beneath me cracked, a jagged fissure racing toward the console. I scrambled away, grabbing the only thing I could, the logbook of Dr. Thorne. I ran toward a rusted ladder on the far wall, marked Emergency Egress, Surface. I climbed. My muscles screamed, my injured ankle throbbed with every rung, but the adrenaline of survival pushed me upward. Below me, the control room groaned and collapsed, burying the tapes, the monitors, and the truth of Sector 9 under tons of rock and earth. I climbed until my hands were raw. I climbed until the air turned from stale dust to the sharp, wet scent of ozone. I pushed open a heavy hatch and spilled out onto the forest floor. I lay there in the mud, gasping for air, the rain washing the grime from my face. I rolled over and looked up. The sky wasn't red. It was the heavy, comforting grey of a Washington dawn. The trees were just trees. The silence was just silence. I sat up and looked around. I was in a small clearing, miles from where I had parked the Jeep. There was no house, no picket fence, just a massive, steaming crater in the earth, the edges of the soil fused into glass, smoking in the rain. It was over. I checked my watch. It was 6:14 a.m., Wednesday. I had been gone for 6 hours, or 3 lifetimes. I limped back to civilization. I resigned the next day. I told them I had a breakdown. I told them the stress of the job had finally gotten to me. They believed me because they wanted to. No one wants to believe that there are things in the woods that eat memories. No one wants to believe that the static on the radio is the sound of a man screaming at himself across time. I moved to the city. I live in a small apartment with thick walls. I don't own a radio. I don't answer numbers I don't recognize. But sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the rain hits the window just right, I hear it. I hear the phone ring, and I wonder which Arthur is calling. Is it the one who died in the fire? Is it the one who is still driving the Jeep? Or is it a fourth version, one I haven't met yet, waiting for the loop to start again? Because I kept the logbook. And on the very last page, in handwriting that looks exactly like mine, but written in ink that hasn't dried yet, there is one final entry. It didn't die, Arthur. It just learned how to use the phone. The logbook sits on my desk now, next to a phone I've unplugged from the wall. Every time I look at the leather cover, the ink inside seems fresh, glistening as if wet. I share this account not for fame, but as a warning. There are thin places in this world, places where the walls between here and there are worn down to the bone. We walk past them every day, oblivious. But sometimes, the fog rolls in. Sometimes, the static clears. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and you hear a radio turn on by itself, or if you see a house that looks too perfect, too clean, too remembered, turn around, run, and never, ever look back, because the story isn't over until it has consumed you. This file is now closed, but the archives of The Watcher are vast and deep. If you have the stomach to explore more restricted files from the deep woods, the forgotten asylums, and the dark corners of the earth, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. You do not want to miss the next transmission. We are just getting started. I need to know who is out there in the dark with me. Tell me in the comments below, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And let me know, did this story make you check your own locks? Until next time, stay on the path.